A black man finds himself in a tough spot being disrespected and arrested by officers who also refuse to let him make a phone call. But what happens next leaves everyone in shock. Discover how resilience and bravery can turn even the darkest situations around. The soft golden glow of the late afternoon filled the room, casting gentle shadows across the cluttered desk. Piles of letters and papers stood like small mountains, some neatly tied with ribbons, others scattered in disarray. Each envelope had a different address, but they all carried the same urgent message: "Help us, Dr. Williams." Marcus Williams leaned back in his chair, the worn leather creaking beneath him. His fingers traced the edge of an open letter, though his mind wandered elsewhere. On the desk sat an invitation printed on thick, cream-colored paper, the bold black letters at the top reading, "Civil Rights Conference, Atlanta Chapter." Marcus had long lost track of how many such invitations he had received over the years. Normally, he would have accepted without a second thought, but something about this one made him hesitate. It wasn't the location, though the Deep South still held a dangerous history, but rather a growing doubt within himself. He stood up and walked to the window, pushing it open just enough to let the cool breeze in. The sounds of the city drifted in, children laughing, a street vendor calling out his wares, the faint hum of traffic. These were the sounds of life, the life he had worked so hard to protect and uplift. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that his efforts, his words, had become a quiet echo in a world that refused to change. His secretary, Samantha, entered with her usual efficiency, a stack of freshly sorted mail in hand. "You've been staring at that letter for hours," she said, setting the mail down. "What's holding you back?" Marcus turned and gave her a faint smile. "Samantha, do you ever feel like the world is moving faster than we can change it?" Samantha raised an eyebrow. "Is that a rhetorical question, or are you asking for my professional opinion?" Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "Both, perhaps. It's just, there are days when I wonder if what we do really makes a difference. Words can only go so far. People listen, they clap, but do they change?" Samantha crossed her arms, her expression softening. "Marcus, you've saved lives with your work. You've inspired countless people to stand up for themselves. You might not see the change immediately, but it's happening. Don't let doubt stop you now." He nodded slowly, her words stirring something deep inside him. The doubts remained, but so did the responsibility. The next morning, Marcus stood outside his brownstone, suitcase in hand. A sleek black car pulled up, and the driver stepped out to greet him. "Dr. Williams?" "Yes, that's me," Marcus said, shaking the young man's hand. "I'm John. I'll be driving you to Atlanta." "Pleasure to meet you, sir." John, in his early 20s, had an energy that seemed to radiate from him. As they loaded Marcus's suitcase into the trunk, the young man's excitement was palpable. "I've read about you," John said as they pulled away from the curb. "It's an honor to work with someone who's actually making history." Marcus smiled but said nothing, letting the compliment pass. As they left the city behind, the landscape began to change. Tall buildings gave way to rolling hills and endless stretches of farmland. The car hummed along the highway, and for a while, the two men sat in companionable silence. "So, what's it like?" John finally asked. "What's what like?" Marcus replied, glancing at the young man. "Being you. Making speeches, fighting the good fight, knowing people look up to you." Marcus thought for a moment before responding. "It's humbling, but it's also heavy. When people look up to you, they expect you to have all the answers. And the truth is, I don't. I'm just as lost as anyone else, trying to find my way." John nodded thoughtfully. "That's honest. I like that." As they drove further south, the atmosphere began to shift. The vibrant greenery appeared duller, the air heavier. John pointed out small towns they passed, each with its own history and character. "See that diner?" John said, gesturing to a faded building with a welcoming sign. "My uncle told me they still have separate entrances for black and white folks. Can you believe that?" Marcus said nothing, but his expression grew somber. Further down the road, they stopped at a gas station. The man behind the counter, with a grizzled beard, barely looked up as Marcus approached. "That'll be $1, the man said curtly. Marcus handed over the money and waited for his change, but the man simply turned away, pretending to busy himself with something else. "Sir," Marcus said calmly, "you owe me 50 cents. The man turned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're lucky I even sold it to you," he muttered, tossing the coins onto the counter. Marcus picked up the change without a word and walked out. Back in the car, John noticed his silence. "Everything okay?" "Just a reminder," Marcus said quietly, "of how much work we still have to do." The road ahead stretched on, winding through forests and empty fields. The air in the car seemed to grow heavier with unspoken tension as they neared their destination. Finally, John broke the silence. "We should probably take the detour," he said, glancing at a map. "The main road goes through a rough area." Marcus shook his head. "We stick to the direct road." John hesitated. "I'm not trying to argue, but are you sure? That's not the safest road for folks like us." Marcus's gaze was steady. "Fear is what they want. If we avoid the main road, we give them power. We'll be fine." As they continued down the narrow, empty stretch of highway, the tension grew palpable. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. John's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, but he said nothing. Marcus stared out the window, his thoughts distant yet resolute. In the distance, the faint glow of headlights appeared. A patrol car was parked at the edge of the road, its silhouette stark against the fading light. John's voice was barely above a whisper. "I hope you're right, Dr. Williams." Marcus didn't reply. He simply straightened his posture, his expression unreadable. As they approached the car, the patrol car's lights flashed once, then again. John slowed to a stop, his breath shallow. The next moment would change everything. The patrol car's lights bathed the narrow stretch of road in red and blue, casting fleeting shadows across the trees. The oppressive silence in the car was broken only by the faint hum of the engine. John glanced nervously at Marcus, who sat upright, his expression calm but resolute. "They're stopping us," John muttered, gripping the wheel tightly, his voice trembling with unease. Marcus nodded once, his gaze fixed ahead. "Stay calm. Don't argue. Let me do the talking." John swallowed hard as he eased the car to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness of the evening. The patrol car pulled up behind them, its headlights glaring through the rear window. Two officers stepped out, one tall and lean, his uniform immaculate, his face set in a cold, stern expression, the other stockier, his movements brusque, his hat tilted slightly askew. The tall officer approached on John's side, while his partner circled the car to Marcus's window. "Evening," the tall officer drawled, leaning down to peer at John through the open window. "License and registration." John fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking slightly as he handed over his license. Marcus reached into the glove compartment and retrieved the registration papers, passing them to John, who handed them to the officer. "Whose car is this?" the officer asked, narrowing his eyes. "It's mine," Marcus replied, his voice steady. The second officer, standing at Marcus's window, let out a low chuckle. "Yours, huh? A fancy car like this doesn't seem to add up." Marcus met the man's gaze without flinching. "The paperwork is in order. You can verify it." The tall officer scanned the documents, his frown deepening. He glanced at Marcus, then at John. "What brings you boys out here?" "We're traveling to Atlanta," Marcus replied. "For what?" "A civil rights conference," Marcus said evenly. The stocky officer snorted, his hand resting on the butt of his baton. "Civil rights, huh? You one of those troublemakers stirring up good folks?" Marcus didn't react to the jab. "The paperwork is in order. There's no reason for this to take any longer." The tall officer's expression darkened. "Step out of the car." Marcus nodded and opened his door, stepping out with deliberate calm. John followed, his movements stiff and hesitant. The officers guided them to the back of the car. The stocky one began patting down Marcus, while the tall one searched John. "This car is way too nice for someone like you," the stocky officer muttered as he patted Marcus's pockets. "Bet you stole it." "I purchased it legally," Marcus replied. "You can check the registration." The officer ignored him, moving on to his briefcase. He opened it and rifled through the papers inside, scattering them carelessly onto the ground. "Hey!" John protested. "You can't just." "Quiet," the tall officer barked, shoving John against the car. Marcus's voice was firm but calm. "There's no need for this. We've done nothing wrong." The stocky officer straightened, his face darkening. "You don't tell us what we need to do." For a long moment, the air was thick with tension. Then the tall officer spoke. "All right. I think we've seen enough. Put your hands behind your back." John's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "Suspicion of stolen property," the officer replied curtly. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, his tone still measured. "Ridiculous or not, you're under arrest," the stocky officer said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. As the cold metal clamped around his wrists, Marcus's mind raced. He knew arguing would only make things worse. He met John's panicked gaze and gave a small, reassuring nod. "We'll handle this," he said quietly. The officers led them to the patrol car and shoved them into the back seat. Marcus stared out the window as the car began to move, the scenery passing by in a blur. He felt a storm brewing within him, a mix of anger and frustration, but he forced himself to remain composed. John sat beside him, his breathing shallow. "What are we going to do, Dr. Williams?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes, drawing on every ounce of strength he had. "We're going to stay calm," he said finally. "And we're going to demand our rights." The patrol car pulled into a small police station, a squat brick building with dimly lit windows. The officers escorted them inside, where a grizzled desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork. "Got a couple of troublemakers," the tall officer said, tossing their documents onto the counter. The sergeant glanced at Marcus and John, his expression unreadable. "Put them in holding. We'll deal with them later." The officers led them down a narrow hallway lined with cells. They shoved John into one and Marcus into another, locking the heavy iron doors behind them. The stocky officer leaned close to the bars, a sneer on his face. "Welcome to the South, Professor. Hope you enjoy your stay." As their footsteps receded, Marcus sat down on the cold, hard bench. His wrists throbbed from the cuffs, and his shoulders ached, but his mind was sharp, calculating. Across the hall, John gripped the bars of his cell, his face pale. "This ain't right," John said, his voice shaking. "They can't do this." "They can," Marcus said quietly, "and they just did. But we're not going to let them get away with it." John sank onto the bench in his cell, burying his head in his hands. "What if they don't let us out? What if they—" "They won't break us, John," Marcus said firmly. The sound of the station door opening echoed through the halls, followed by the clatter of boots on the tiled floor. Marcus straightened, his resolve hardening. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. The air inside the cell was suffocating, a mix of mildew, sweat, and despair. Marcus sat on the cold metal bench, his hands resting on his knees, his posture as calm as he could manage. He watched John across the hall, pacing like a caged animal. The young man's energy, which earlier had seemed boundless, now boiled into frustration and fear. "How long do you think they'll keep us here?" John finally asked, gripping the bars of his cell. His voice cracked, revealing the fear he tried to mask. Marcus folded his hands together, leaning forward slightly. "As long as they want to intimidate us. But intimidation only works if we let it." John snorted, his pacing quickening. "Easy for you to say. You've been through this before, haven't you? People respect you. Me? I'm just some kid they'll throw away without thinking twice." Marcus stood, crossing the narrow cell. He grasped the bars and looked directly at John. "Don't you ever think that way? They want you to believe you're powerless. But you're not. We're not." John looked at him, his breathing heavy. But before he could reply, the sound of boots on the tiled floor interrupted them. The tall officer, the one Marcus had already come to associate with cruelty disguised as professionalism, appeared at the end of the hallway. Behind him was his stocky partner, whose sneer seemed to have become a permanent fixture. "Rise and shine, boys," the tall officer said, his tone mockingly cheerful. "Time for a little chat." Marcus stepped back from the bars, standing tall. John hesitated but followed suit, his posture less certain. The officers unlocked Marcus's cell first, leading him out with an unnecessary grip on his arm. As they reached John's cell, the stocky officer jabbed a finger at him. "You stay put. We'll deal with you later." John's eyes widened, but Marcus gave him a small nod, silently urging him to stay calm. The officers guided Marcus down the narrow hallway, a dim light flickering overhead. They passed other cells, some empty, others occupied by figures who barely stirred as they walked by. The weight of the station's oppressive atmosphere pressed down on Marcus, but he refused to let it show. They brought him into a small, windowless room with a single metal table and 2 chairs. The tall officer gestured for him to sit, while the stocky one leaned against the door, arms crossed. The tall officer placed a file on the table and sat across from Marcus, opening it with deliberate slowness. "Professor Williams," he began, drawing out the title like a joke, "you've found yourself in quite the predicament." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I'd say it's less of a predicament and more of an injustice." The officer smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You've got a sharp tongue. But let's cut the theatrics. We've got a problem here." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The only problem I see is your abuse of authority." The stocky officer pushed off the door and took a step forward, his face twisting in anger. "Watch it, Professor. You don't get to talk to us like that." The tall officer held up a hand, stopping his partner. Now. Let's not lose our cool. The professor here thinks he's got the upper hand. Let's remind him where he is." He leaned forward, tapping the file in front of him. "This car you're driving? It's too nice for someone like you. A man like you shouldn't be able to afford it." Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "The car is mine. The registration proves it." The officer waved dismissively. "Paperwork can be forged. And even if it's legitimate, it doesn't explain why you're driving through this part of the state. A man like you must be up to something." Marcus clasped his hands together on the table. "A man like me," he said slowly, "is simply traveling to a conference to speak about justice and equality, something you seem determined to prevent." The stocky officer slammed his hand on the table. "You don't get to talk down to us. You think you're better than us?" Marcus didn't flinch. He held the stocky officer's gaze, unyielding. "I think you're afraid. Afraid of what someone like me represents. Change." The tall officer's smirk faltered for a moment before returning. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't get you out of here. We're not interested in your speeches, Professor. We're interested in why you think you can waltz through our town like you own the place." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Because I refuse to be afraid. And you hate that, don't you? You hate that I won't cower before your authority." The stocky officer took another step forward, but the tall one stopped him again. "Enough," he said sharply. He turned back to Marcus. "Here's the deal. You admit you stole that car, and we'll let you off with a slap on the wrist. Keep lying, and things are going to get a lot worse for you." Marcus stared at him, his expression calm but resolute. "I won't admit to something I didn't do." The tall officer's smirk disappeared entirely. He closed the file and stood, looming over Marcus. "Then you'd better get comfortable, Professor. You're not going anywhere." The officers escorted Marcus back to his cell, their grip on his arms tighter than before. They shoved him inside without a word, slamming the door shut behind him. John rushed to the bars, his eyes filled with worry. "What happened? What did they say?" Marcus sat down on the bench, his expression thoughtful. "They want me to admit to stealing the car." I refused. John cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. They're not going to let us go, are they? Marcus looked up at him, his gaze steady. They're trying to break us. But they won't succeed. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The officers passed by occasionally, throwing taunts and insults, but Marcus remained composed. John, however, grew increasingly agitated, his pacing turning into restless energy. At one point, another man was brought into the cell block. He was older, his face lined with years of hardship. He was placed in the cell next to John's and sat down heavily on the bench. "What are you in for?" John asked cautiously. The man chuckled bitterly. "Wrong place, wrong time. Same as you, I reckon." They began to talk in hushed tones, their conversation revealing the man's experiences with the local police and the systemic injustice that plagued the area. His words painted a grim picture, but they also sparked something in John, a growing understanding of the fight Marcus had dedicated his life to. As night fell, the station grew quieter, but the tension remained. Marcus closed his eyes, leaning back against the wall. He thought of his father, a man who had faced his own share of injustices but always held his head high. He thought of the people who looked to him for strength and inspiration. And he resolved to remain unshaken. In the darkness, his voice broke the silence. "John, remember this, they can take our freedom, but they can't take our dignity. That's ours to protect." John nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling over him. The night was long, but Marcus's resolve never wavered. He knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew he wouldn't face it alone. The dim light of dawn seeped through the small, grimy windows near the ceiling of the holding cells. It cast pale beams across the floor, illuminating the cold, unyielding reality of their imprisonment. Marcus sat on the hard bench in his cell, his hands resting on his lap. The weariness from a sleepless night pressed heavily on his shoulders, but his resolve remained unbroken. Across the hallway, John lay curled on his bench, his breathing shallow, his face etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor, breaking the oppressive silence. John stirred, sitting up abruptly as the two officers, tall and stocky, approached. The tall one, whose smugness seemed inexhaustible, wore a thin smirk. The stocky officer, however, looked as though the weight of the night had settled heavily on his conscience. "Rise and shine," the tall officer barked, his voice sharp and mocking. "The professor here looks like he's had a long night. Maybe today he'll come to his senses." John moved to the bars of his cell, gripping them tightly. "You can't keep us here. We haven't done anything wrong." The stocky officer shot John a glance, but it was the tall one who responded. "You're lucky we haven't charged you with resisting arrest, boy. Sit tight, you'll get your turn." Marcus stood slowly, his expression calm but firm. "What exactly is your plan, officer? Keep us here indefinitely? Deny us our rights until we give you what you want?" The tall officer smirked, unlocking Marcus's cell. "You're not in any position to be asking questions, Professor. Let's go. We're going to have another little chat." As they escorted Marcus down the corridor, the stocky officer lingered behind for a moment, his gaze meeting John's. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the injustice unfolding. But before John could say anything, the officer turned and followed his partner. They led Marcus into the same interrogation room as before. The air inside was stale and oppressive. The same metal table awaited him, and the tall officer gestured for him to sit. The stocky officer stood by the door, his posture tense, his eyes avoiding Marcus's. The tall officer dropped a file onto the table and leaned forward, his hands planted firmly on the metal surface. "Here's the deal, Professor. We're getting real tired of your games. You think you're better than us? Think your fancy words and education mean anything here?" Marcus met the officer's gaze evenly. "What I think," he said slowly, "is that you're trying to break me because you can't stand the idea of someone like me standing up to someone like you." The tall officer's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "You've got a lot of nerve. But nerve won't get you out of here." Marcus tilted his head slightly. Neither will intimidation. So why don't we skip the theatrics and get to the point? The tall officer straightened, crossing his arms. Fine. You want your phone call? You've got it. Let's see who's really on your side. The stocky officer shifted uncomfortably by the door but said nothing as the tall officer handed Marcus the phone. His smirk widened. Go ahead. Call whoever you want. Let's see if they can help you. Marcus took the phone, his fingers steady as he dialed. The line rang once, twice, before a calm, authoritative voice answered on the other end. This is the White House operator. How may I direct your call? The tall officer's smirk faltered slightly, and the stocky officer's eyes widened. Marcus's voice was steady as he spoke. This is Dr. Marcus Williams. I need to speak with President Kennedy. It's urgent. The operator hesitated for only a moment. One moment, Dr. Williams. Please hold. The room fell into a tense silence as the call was transferred. The tall officer's smirk had all but disappeared, replaced by a look of disbelief. The stocky officer's hand tightened on the doorframe, his expression unreadable. When the line connected again, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. This is President Kennedy. Marcus spoke calmly, clearly. Mr. President, apologies for the intrusion, but I find myself in a precarious situation. I've been wrongfully detained by local law enforcement while traveling to Atlanta for a civil rights conference. The charges are baseless, and I fear this is yet another attempt to intimidate those of us working for justice and equality. Kennedy's tone was firm, his words measured. Dr. Williams, I assure you this will be addressed immediately. Where are you being held? Marcus provided the information, his words crisp and deliberate. He didn't glance at the officers, but he could feel the tension radiating from them. When the call ended, Marcus hung up the phone and folded his hands on the table. Well, he said quietly, I believe help is on the way. The tall officer's face was a mask of barely contained fury. You think you can just call the president and get away with this? Who the hell do you think you are? Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. A citizen who knows his rights. And a man who refuses to be silenced. The stocky officer cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. Tom, maybe we should. Shut up, David, the tall officer snapped, slamming his hands on the table. This isn't over. But it was clear even to him that the balance of power had shifted. He stormed out of the room, leaving David to escort Marcus back to his cell. As they walked down the corridor, David's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. I didn't sign up for this, he said, not meeting Marcus's gaze. Marcus glanced at him, his expression softening slightly. Then perhaps it's time to decide what you stand for. When they reached the cell, John was waiting anxiously, his hands gripping the bars. What happened? What did you do? Marcus stepped inside as the door clanged shut behind him. I made a call, he said simply. Now we wait. Hours passed, the tension in the station growing thicker with each passing minute. The tall officer paced the hallway, barking orders at anyone who crossed his path, while David kept to the shadows, his expression troubled. Finally, the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside shattered the uneasy quiet. Moments later, the door to the station burst open, and a group of federal agents entered, their presence commanding and unmistakable. The lead agent, a tall man in a crisp suit, approached the desk sergeant with a no-nonsense expression. We're here for Dr. Marcus Williams. Release him immediately. The sergeant stammered, his face pale. I'll need to speak to the officers in charge. The agent cut him off. No, you won't. This is a federal matter now. Get him out here. The tall officer appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger. You can't just barge in here. We can, the agent said coldly. And we will, unless you want to explain to the president himself why you've unlawfully detained an innocent man. The next moments were a blur of activity. Marcus and John were released from their cells, their personal belongings hastily returned to them. The tall officer glared at Marcus, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, John let out a shaky laugh, his relief palpable. "I can't believe it. We're free." Marcus nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "For now. But this isn't the end, not for us, and not for them." The federal agents escorted them to a waiting car, the promise of safety lingering in the air. But as Marcus looked back at the station, he knew the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning. The evening air felt heavy, laden with the weight of the day's events. Marcus sat in the back of the black sedan provided by the federal agents, the soft thrum of the engine a sharp contrast to the chaos he had left behind. John was seated beside him, his shoulders slumped, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Despite their release, a quiet tension hung in the air, an unspoken understanding that the events of the day were far from over. The lead agent, a no-nonsense man named Peterson, turned in his seat to address Marcus. "Dr. Williams, I want to assure you that what happened today will not go unaddressed. The president himself has taken a personal interest in this matter." Marcus nodded, his expression composed but thoughtful. "I appreciate the intervention, Agent Peterson. But this isn't just about me. What happened in that station is a symptom of a much larger problem. If we don't address the root, the cycle will continue." Peterson's face tightened, a flicker of unease crossing his features. "I understand your frustration, sir, but these things take time." Marcus's gaze shifted to the window, the darkened landscape rolling by. "Time," he said softly, "is something too many people no longer have." John shifted beside him, breaking the silence. "What happens to them now? Those officers, I mean. Are they just going to get a slap on the wrist?" Peterson hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "An investigation will be launched. Beyond that, I can't say." Marcus pressed his lips into a thin line but didn't push further. He knew the system all too well, the slow grind of bureaucracy, the resistance to change. It wasn't enough to expose injustice, the real battle was ensuring accountability. The car eventually pulled up to a modest motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. Peterson stepped out first, motioning for them to follow. "We've arranged for a safe place for you to stay tonight. We'll have agents stationed nearby in case there are any issues." Marcus and John stepped out, their legs stiff from the long ride. The motel was unremarkable, its neon sign flickering faintly in the night. Despite its modesty, the sight of it offered a small measure of relief, a chance to rest, if only briefly. Inside their room, John collapsed onto one of the twin beds, letting out a long, weary sigh. "I can't believe we made it out of there. I thought for sure we were done for." Marcus sat on the edge of the other bed, his hands clasped tightly together. "We were fortunate. But fortune isn't a solution." John propped himself up on one elbow, frowning. "You mean those guys back at the station, they'll just keep doing this to people, won't they?" Marcus's gaze was distant, his thoughts turning to the countless stories he had heard over the years, lives ruined, families torn apart by the same kind of systemic abuse they had just faced. "Unless we stop them, yes." John sat up fully now, his expression hardening. "Then let's stop them. Let's make sure they can't do this to anyone else." Marcus turned to look at him, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "It's not that simple, John. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes strategy, persistence, and, above all, people willing to stand together." John nodded slowly, his youthful determination undimmed. "Then we start with us." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Marcus rose cautiously, peering through the peephole before opening it. Agent Peterson stood there, his expression grim. "Dr. Williams, there's something you need to see." Marcus followed him outside, where a federal car was parked with its radio on. The agent inside gestured for them to listen. "Local authorities have denied any wrongdoing in the detention of civil rights activist Dr. Marcus Williams. Sheriff's Office representatives claimed the arrest was carried out in accordance with procedure and have accused Dr. Williams of attempting to incite unrest." John, who had followed them outside, let out a string of curses. "They're trying to make you the bad guy." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "This isn't unexpected. They're protecting their own. Peterson looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. We're preparing an official response, but this kind of thing can be difficult to navigate. Marcus turned to him, his gaze sharp. Difficult? They're lying to cover up their abuse of power, and you're worried about navigating? This isn't just about me, it's about every person who's been silenced, every family that's been torn apart by this kind of corruption. Peterson raised his hands defensively. I understand, Dr. Williams. But these things have to be handled carefully. We can't risk escalating the situation. Marcus's voice was low, but the steel in it was unmistakable. Escalation is inevitable when injustice is ignored. The longer we wait, the more people will suffer. The rest of the night passed fitfully, tension hanging heavy in the air. John eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, but Marcus remained awake, his mind racing. He replayed the events of the day, searching for a way to turn their ordeal into a catalyst for change. By morning, he had a plan. When they arrived in Atlanta for the conference, the atmosphere was electric. News of Marcus's detention had spread, drawing media attention and amplifying the significance of his speech. As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He began slowly, his voice calm but powerful. Yesterday, I was reminded of the reality many of us face every day, a reality where dignity is stripped away, and justice is denied. But I was also reminded of something greater, the power of solidarity, the strength we find in standing together against oppression. He recounted the events of their journey, sparing no detail. The audience listened intently, their anger and determination palpable. This is not just my story, Marcus continued. It is the story of countless others who have suffered in silence. And it is our responsibility to ensure that silence is broken. The room erupted into applause, a wave of energy that seemed to shake the very walls. After the speech, Marcus and John were approached by reporters, activists, and community leaders, all eager to support their cause. Among them was a local lawyer who offered to help bring legal action against the officers and the station that had detained them. Marcus accepted, knowing that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But as he looked around at the faces of those who stood with him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. That night, as he sat alone in his hotel room, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought of his father, of the lessons he had taught him about dignity and perseverance. He thought of the countless lives that had been touched by injustice, and the countless more that could be changed through their efforts. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope. The hotel lobby was bustling with activity the morning after Marcus's speech. The news of his ordeal had spread like wildfire, drawing journalists, activists, and supporters from across the region. Marcus sat in a corner with John, watching the commotion unfold around them. The energy was palpable, a mix of outrage and determination filled the air with a sense of purpose. John leaned back in his chair, his face a blend of amazement and exhaustion. You know, Dr. Williams, I've never seen anything like this. People are fired up. They're ready to do something. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on a group of young activists discussing plans for a march. That's the power of truth, John. When people see injustice laid bare, it ignites a fire within them. The challenge is to turn that fire into action. John smiled wryly. Well, you sure know how to light a fire. Before Marcus could respond, a man approached their table. He was tall and wiry, with sharp features and a piercing gaze. Extending a hand, he introduced himself. Dr. Williams, I'm Michael Green with the Southern Justice Initiative. I'd like to speak with you if you have a moment. Marcus shook his hand, gesturing for him to sit. Of course, Mr. Green. What can I do for you? Green took a seat, his expression serious. First, I want to commend you for what you've done. Your courage has inspired a movement. But we both know inspiration isn't enough. We need action, and we need it now. Marcus's brow furrowed slightly. What do you have in mind? Leaning forward, Green spoke in a low, intense voice. We're organizing a campaign to push for federal oversight of local law enforcement, particularly in areas with a history of racial discrimination. Your story has given us the momentum we need to make this a national issue. But we need your help to keep that momentum going. Marcus listened carefully, his mind already racing. He had spent years fighting for change, but this was an opportunity to strike at the heart of the system that perpetuated injustice. I'll do whatever I can, he said finally. But we need to be strategic. This can't just be about me. It has to be about the countless others who face the same injustice. Green nodded, a hint of a smile breaking through his stern demeanor. That's exactly what we're aiming for. We're holding a rally tomorrow to kick off the campaign. Your presence and your voice would mean everything. Marcus agreed, and Green excused himself to continue his preparations. As he walked away, John turned to Marcus, his eyes wide. You're really doing this, aren't you? Taking on the whole system? Marcus smiled faintly. I'm not taking it on alone, John. None of us are. That's the only way we'll win it together. The next day dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that seemed almost at odds with the heavy burden of the work ahead. The rally was held in a sprawling park on the outskirts of the city, the open space quickly filling with a diverse crowd. Signs and banners waved in the breeze, their messages bold and unyielding: justice now. End police brutality. Equality for all. Marcus stood behind the stage, watching as the crowd continued to grow. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the hope and determination that radiated from them. It was a weight he carried willingly, knowing that his voice could amplify theirs. John joined him, holding a small notebook. I jotted down some things you might want to include in your speech, he said, handing it over. Marcus glanced through the notes, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You've got a knack for this, John. Maybe you should be the one up there. John laughed, shaking his head. I'll leave that to you, document. But seriously, you're going to kill it. When it was time, Marcus stepped onto the stage. The crowd's cheers washed over him like a tidal wave. He raised a hand, and the noise subsided, replaced by an expectant hush. He began slowly, his voice calm but powerful. My friends, today we stand together not just to demand justice but to affirm our humanity. Yesterday, I was reminded of the depths of injustice that persist in our world. But I was also reminded of something greater: the power of unity, of resilience, of hope. He recounted his experience at the hands of the police, his words vivid and unflinching. The crowd listened intently, their expressions a mix of anger and determination. But this is not just my story, Marcus continued. It is the story of every man, woman, and child who has been silenced, oppressed, or denied their dignity. And it is our responsibility, no, our duty, to ensure that their voices are heard. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy palpable. Marcus waited for the noise to subside before delivering his final words. Change will not come easily. It will not come quickly. But it will come, because we will not stop. We will not be silenced. We will not rest until justice is not just a word but a reality for all. As he stepped off the stage, the crowd surged forward, their cheers echoing across the park. Reporters clamored for interviews, activists sought his advice, and ordinary citizens simply wanted to shake his hand. Among them was David, the younger officer from the station. He approached cautiously, his expression conflicted. Dr. Williams, he began, his voice hesitant. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened, for my part in it. Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. Acknowledging your part is the first step, Officer David. The next step is deciding what you'll do about it. David nodded slowly, his gaze steady. I've already started. I'm leaving the force, and I'm joining a group that's working on police reform. It's the least I can do. Marcus extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, David shook it. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of possibility. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Marcus sat alone in his hotel room, reflecting on the day. The fight ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming, and he was ready to meet it. The sound of soft footsteps echoed through the nearly empty conference room. Marcus sat at a long table, his pen moving steadily across the pages of a notebook. The rally from the previous day still lingered in his mind, the roar of the crowd, the determined faces, the unspoken promise of change. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the reality of what lay ahead loomed large. He had no illusions about the challenges they faced. Change, as he had told John, would not come quickly or easily. But it would come. It had to. A knock at the door broke his concentration. He looked up to see John standing there, a stack of papers in his hands and a familiar eager energy in his posture. "Hope I'm not interrupting," John said, stepping inside. Marcus set down his pen and gestured for him to sit. "Not at all. What's on your mind?" John dropped the papers onto the table, spreading them out like a deck of cards. "Plans," he said simply. "Ideas for how we keep this momentum going. Carter's group is pushing for more rallies, but I think we need to go deeper: policy changes, legal challenges, grassroots organizing. Things that make this movement last." Marcus smiled faintly, his respect for the younger man growing by the day. "You've been busy." John shrugged, but there was pride in his voice. "I figure if we're going to do this, we've got to do it right. Yesterday was amazing, but it's just the beginning." Marcus picked up one of the papers, scanning the handwritten notes. John's ideas were ambitious but thoughtful, ranging from community education programs to partnerships with local churches and businesses. "This is good work," Marcus said, setting the paper down. "You're thinking about sustainability, about building something that lasts. That's exactly what we need." John beamed at Marcus's praise, but his expression quickly turned serious. "There's one thing, though. I've been thinking about what you said to that officer, David, about deciding what you stand for. And I realized I don't just want to be the guy holding signs or passing out flyers. I want to do more." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. "What kind of more are you thinking?" John hesitated for a moment but then spoke with conviction. "I want to learn about organizing, about the law, about how to actually make change happen. I want to be like you." Marcus's expression softened, a rare smile breaking through his usual calm demeanor. "John, the world doesn't need another me. It needs you, with your own voice, your own perspective. But if you're serious about this, I'll help you any way I can." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Michael Green, who entered the room with his usual brisk energy. He carried a newspaper under his arm, the bold headline immediately catching Marcus's eye: "Civil Rights Leader Demands Justice in the Deep South." Green slapped the paper onto the table, grinning. "Your front page news, Dr. Williams. And not just here. Papers across the country are picking this up. Your story has lit a fire." Marcus picked up the newspaper, his gaze lingering on the photo beneath the headline. It showed him at the rally, his fist raised in defiance, the crowd a sea of determination behind him. "This isn't just my story," Marcus said, setting the paper down. "It's the story of every person who's faced injustice. We have to make sure their voices are heard." Green's expression turned serious. "That's why I'm here. We need to talk about next steps. The momentum is building, but if we don't channel it effectively, it'll fizzle out. The powers that be are already working to discredit us." John frowned. "You mean those statements from the sheriff's office? Saying Dr. Williams was trying to incite unrest?" "Exactly," Green said. "They're trying to paint us as agitators, troublemakers. We need to control the narrative, and that means being strategic about our actions." The three men spent the next several hours deep in discussion, mapping out a plan to sustain the movement. They talked about organizing more rallies, filing lawsuits against corrupt law enforcement, and working with sympathetic politicians to push for federal oversight. As the meeting wound down, Marcus felt a sense of purpose settle over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they were truly moving forward. That evening, Marcus returned to his hotel room, exhausted but energized. He sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky. His thoughts drifted to David, the young officer who had apologized at the rally. The memory of their brief conversation lingered, a reminder that even those complicit in injustice could choose a different path. It was a small glimmer of hope, but one that felt significant. Marcus reached for his notebook and began to write, his pen moving steadily across the page. He wrote about the rally, about the plans they had discussed, and about the people who had inspired him, John, Green, and even David. As he wrote, he thought about his father, a man who had faced his own share of injustices but had always held his head high. His father's words echoed in his mind, "Dignity is not about how others see you, it's about how you see yourself." The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. David stood in the lobby, looking nervous but determined. "I'm sorry to bother you," David said as Marcus approached, "but I needed to talk to you. I've been thinking about what you said, about deciding what I stand for." Marcus gestured for him to sit, his expression encouraging. "What's on your mind?" David hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I left the force. I couldn't keep being part of something I didn't believe in. But I don't want to just walk away. I want to help fix it." Marcus listened carefully, nodding. "That's a difficult choice, David, but it's the right one. Real change starts with people willing to take a stand." David's voice grew steadier as he spoke. "I've already started reaching out to groups working on police reform. I want to be part of the solution." Marcus extended a hand, and David shook it firmly. "You've taken the first step, David. Now comes the hard part. But you're not alone in this." As David left, Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope. Change was coming, not just in the halls of power, but in the hearts and minds of people willing to stand up for what was right. Later that evening, as Marcus prepared for another rally, he looked out over the city, the lights twinkling like stars. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt like they were truly moving forward. He knew deep in his heart that they would not stop until justice was not just a dream but a reality for all. The rally that night was smaller than the previous days, but no less impactful. It was held in a church basement, the intimate setting allowing for deeper, more personal conversations. Marcus spoke to the attendees, emphasizing the importance of persistence and unity. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he told them. "But it does happen. And it starts with each of us refusing to accept the unacceptable." The audience nodded, their determination evident. Among them was a young mother who spoke tearfully about her brother, who had been wrongfully imprisoned. A retired teacher shared her story of facing discrimination in the school system. Their voices were raw and powerful, a testament to the deep wounds inflicted by systemic injustice. After the rally, Marcus stayed behind to speak with attendees individually. One by one, they shared their stories, their struggles, their hopes. He listened intently, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. As the evening wore on, he felt a growing sense of connection, a reminder that this fight was not his alone. As the night deepened, Marcus returned to his hotel room, his mind buzzing with the stories he had heard and the faces of those who had shared them. Each voice carried a different struggle, yet they all shared a common thread, a desire for dignity and justice. That shared purpose gave Marcus strength. The next morning, he woke to a barrage of phone calls and messages. Word of the rally had spread, and reporters were eager to interview him. Activists from across the country were reaching out, offering their support. Marcus knew this momentum couldn't be wasted, it had to be channeled into action. By midday, Marcus met with Michael Green and other members of the Southern Justice Initiative to discuss their strategy. Around the conference table sat lawyers, organizers, and local leaders, each bringing their own expertise and perspective to the discussion. Green opened the meeting with a firm tone. "The sheriff's office and local officials are doubling down on their narrative, claiming Dr. Williams was inciting unrest. We need to counter that with facts, but more importantly, with a broader message. This isn't just about one incident, it's about the systemic abuse of power." One of the lawyers, a young woman named Angela, chimed in. "We should file a civil rights lawsuit against the officers who detained Dr. Williams and the station that held him. If we can get this case into federal court, it will shine a spotlight on the practices in this region." Another organizer added, "We also need to involve local communities. Rallies are important, but sustained change comes from grassroots efforts, education programs, voter registration drives, and community building initiatives. Marcus nodded as he listened, his mind racing with possibilities. When the discussion turned to him, he spoke with measured conviction. I agree with all of you. We need to fight this on multiple fronts: legal, political, and social. But we also need to remember that this movement isn't just about the people in this room. It's about those whose voices have been silenced for too long. We have to uplift them. The meeting ended with a clear plan. A lawsuit would be filed immediately, more rallies and events would be organized to keep the momentum alive, and a coalition of civil rights groups would coordinate their efforts to demand federal oversight of law enforcement practices in the South. That evening, Marcus addressed another rally, this time in a packed community center. The room was alive with energy, the crowd eager to hear his words. My friends, he began, his voice steady and resolute, we are at a crossroads. The events of the past few days have exposed the depths of injustice that persist in our society. But they have also shown us something else: the power of solidarity, the strength of a united people. He paused, scanning the room, meeting the eyes of those who had come to listen. This fight is not just about me. It's about the countless others who have suffered in silence. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what we have endured. And it's about building a future where justice is not a privilege, but a right. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the room. As Marcus stepped off the stage, he was approached by an elderly man who introduced himself as Reverend Carter, a local pastor. Dr. Williams, the Reverend said, gripping Marcus's hand firmly, I want you to know that our church is behind you. We'll do whatever we can to support this movement. Marcus smiled warmly. Thank you, Reverend. Your support means more than I can say. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus and his team crisscrossed the region, meeting with community leaders, attending rallies, and strategizing with legal and political allies. Each event brought new challenges but also new allies, people who were willing to stand up and fight for justice. Among them was a young man named Thomas, who had been inspired by Marcus's story. He approached Marcus after a rally, his voice trembling with emotion. Dr. Williams, I've been scared my whole life to speak up. But seeing you stand up to them, it made me realize I can't stay silent anymore. What can I do to help? Marcus placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. The fact that you're willing to stand up is a powerful first step. Find others who feel the same way, and work together. This fight needs all of us. 1 week later, the movement took a significant step forward when Angela filed the civil rights lawsuit on behalf of Marcus and others who had been victims of police misconduct. The case immediately drew national attention, sparking debates in the media and putting pressure on local officials. In the weeks that followed, Marcus traveled to Washington, D.C., to testify before a congressional committee on civil rights. His testimony was powerful, recounting not only his own experience but the broader systemic issues that plagued communities across the country. This isn't just about one incident, Marcus told the committee. It's about a system that allows these incidents to happen over and over again. If we are truly committed to justice, we must dismantle this system and build one that serves all people, not just a privileged few. His words resonated far beyond the hearing room, galvanizing support for federal legislation aimed at reforming law enforcement practices. Back in the South, the lawsuit began to gain traction. Depositions revealed a pattern of abuse within the sheriff's department, and testimonies from other victims painted a damning picture of systemic racism and corruption. As the case moved forward, Marcus became a symbol of hope and resilience for those who had long felt powerless. But the fight was not without its challenges. Local officials and law enforcement pushed back fiercely, using every tactic at their disposal to discredit Marcus and the movement. Threats and intimidation became a regular occurrence, but Marcus refused to be deterred. This isn't just about me, he reminded his supporters. It's about all of us. And together, we're unstoppable. The pressure on Marcus and the movement continued to mount. Local officials were relentless in their efforts to silence them, and the threats became increasingly personal. Late-night phone calls, anonymous letters, and hostile crowds outside rallies were constant reminders of the dangers they faced. But for every threat, there were twice as many voices offering support. Marcus remained steadfast, knowing that the stakes were too high to back down. The lawsuit against the sheriff's department had become a focal point of national attention. Journalists from major outlets followed the case closely, exposing the depth of corruption in the local law enforcement system. The sheriff and his deputies, once confident in their impunity, now faced growing scrutiny. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to travel, speaking at rallies and meetings across the country. Each event drew larger crowds, filled with people inspired by his courage and determination. He used every opportunity to emphasize the importance of collective action. At one such event in Birmingham, Marcus addressed a packed church hall. The audience was a diverse mix of ages and backgrounds: students, laborers, clergy, and families. He stood at the pulpit, his voice carrying over the restless murmurs. "My brothers and sisters," he began, "our struggle is not new. For generations, we have fought for the right to be seen as equals, for the right to live with dignity. And for generations, we have faced those who would deny us those rights. But look around you tonight. Look at the faces of those who stand beside you. This is the power of unity. This is the power of hope." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "The journey ahead will not be easy. We will face resistance, hatred, and fear. But we will not face it alone. And we will not be defeated, because the cause of justice is greater than any one of us. Together, we will persevere." The room erupted into applause, the sound reverberating off the walls. Marcus stepped down from the pulpit, shaking hands and exchanging words of encouragement with attendees. Among them was a teenage girl who approached him hesitantly. "Dr. Williams," she said, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted to thank you. My brother, he was killed by the police last year. Hearing you speak gives me hope that things can change." Marcus knelt to meet her eyes, his expression gentle. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your brother's life mattered, and his story will not be forgotten. You being here tonight is a testament to your strength, and I promise you, we will keep fighting." The lawsuit gained a major victory when a federal judge allowed the case to proceed, rejecting the sheriff's department's attempt to have it dismissed. Depositions began in earnest, revealing damning evidence of widespread misconduct. Community members who had long been silent now came forward, sharing their own experiences of abuse and injustice. Their testimonies painted a vivid picture of a system designed to oppress rather than protect. Angela, the lawyer leading the case, worked tirelessly with her team to ensure that every voice was heard. Her dedication impressed Marcus, who often stayed late at the legal team's office to review documents and strategize. "You're doing incredible work, Angela," Marcus told her one evening. "This case is more than just a lawsuit. It's a beacon for people who've been waiting for someone to stand up for them." Angela smiled, her eyes weary but determined. "Thank you, Dr. Williams. But none of this would be happening without you. Your courage has inspired all of us to believe we can win." While the legal battle unfolded, Marcus continued to work on building the grassroots movement. John had taken a leadership role, organizing workshops and voter registration drives in underserved communities. His confidence had grown immensely, and Marcus often marveled at the young man's transformation. At a small community meeting in Selma, John addressed a room of local residents. "I know it feels like the system is stacked against us," he said passionately. "And I won't lie to you, it is. But that's exactly why we have to keep pushing. Every vote we cast, every conversation we have, every step we take, it all matters. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it doesn't happen at all if we don't start." After the meeting, Marcus pulled John aside. "You're doing incredible work, John. You remind me why I started this fight in the first place." John grinned, his eyes shining. "Thanks, document. I learned from the best." As the months passed, the movement began to see tangible results. Several local officials were forced to resign in the wake of the lawsuit's revelations, and federal investigators launched a broader inquiry into police practices in the region. Community organizations grew stronger, their efforts bolstered by the national attention the case had garnered. But progress came at a cost. Marcus faced relentless criticism and smear campaigns from his opponents, who sought to undermine his credibility. Despite the attacks, he remained focused, reminding himself that the fight was not about him but about the people he represented. One night, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and court proceedings, Marcus sat alone in his hotel room. He stared out the window at the quiet street below, his thoughts heavy. The weight of the movement, the constant scrutiny, and the sacrifices he had made threatened to overwhelm him. He reached for his notebook, the worn pages a refuge for his thoughts. He wrote, "Change is a slow, painful process. It demands everything we have and more. But it is also the most important work we can do. For every step we take, no matter how small, brings us closer to the world we dream of. A world where justice is not a privilege, but a reality." The final stages of the lawsuit were marked by intense courtroom battles. Angela and her team presented a mountain of evidence, their arguments bolstered by the courageous testimonies of community members. The sheriff's department, on the defensive, struggled to counter the overwhelming proof of their misconduct. The trial drew national attention, with reporters and spectators packing the courtroom each day. Marcus attended every session, his presence a reminder of what was at stake. When the jury finally delivered their verdict, finding the sheriff's department guilty of multiple civil rights violations, the room erupted in applause. It was a monumental victory, one that marked a turning point in the fight for justice. The court's decision led to significant reforms, including federal oversight of the sheriff's department and mandatory training programs for officers. But Marcus knew the work was far from over. As he stood on the courthouse steps, addressing the crowd that had gathered to celebrate the verdict, Marcus's voice rang out with hope and determination. "This victory belongs to all of us," he declared. "To every person who stood up, who spoke out, who refused to be silenced. It is proof that change is possible when we come together. But let me be clear, this is not the end. It is only the beginning. The road ahead is long, but we will walk it together, step by step, until justice is a reality for everyone." The crowd cheered, their voices a powerful testament to the movement they had built. Later that evening, as Marcus walked through the quiet streets of the city, he reflected on how far they had come. The fight for justice was far from over, but the victories they had achieved proved that progress was possible. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the generations yet to come.